But even more frustrating than watching the pundits on CNBC talk about the economy and the markets is watching some of the confirmation hearings with the Senate Judiciary Committee and Amy Coney Barrett. And, the first thing that comes to my mind as I'm listening to these senators is none of these guys or gals knows anything about the U.S. Constitution. And, you would think that they would because they all swear an oath to support and defend it, from all enemies, domestic and foreign. That's, to be a senator, right? You got to swear this oath. You would think that they understood the document that they were swearing an oath to, but they're completely clueless. And it's not like the Constitution is very difficult to understand. It's actually a very easy document to understand. The problem is if you understand it, it pretty much makes illegal almost everything the government already does. I'm talking about the federal government and everything that the federal government wants to do. That's the reason that so many people have to pretend that they don't understand it because they don't like what it says. In fact, they like to describe two schools of constitutional thought, right? There are people who want to interpret the Constitution based on the original intent of the people who wrote it, right? And then there's another group of people that say, hey, let's interpret the Constitution based on what we want it to mean, right? That the Constitution is some kind of living, breathing document that evolves over time, and so it means whatever we want it to mean. So the actual words that are written on the Constitution don't mean anything because we could just impart whatever meaning we want into those words, and therefore we can change the Constitution, which, of course, in and of itself is complete nonsense. I mean, first of all, how can a law change over time based on interpretation? Then it wouldn't even be a law. I mean, to say that we're going to read a law in anything other than the intent of the people who wrote it, I mean, how could that even be a theory? I mean, first of all, the Constitution doesn't have to be interpreted. Right? It's not written in Chinese. And the fact that the founding fathers meant the Constitution to mean what it says, to not be this living, breathing document that changes over time, is the fact that they establish a process to amend the Constitution. So if you don't like something in the Constitution, if you want to change something in the Constitution, then amend it. I mean, if the Constitution just evolved over time and it meant whatever you wanted it to mean, then what would be the purpose of having to amend it? And we have amended the Constitution. They wanted to tax income without regard to apportionment. They wanted a direct tax on income. Supreme Court says you can't do that. So they amended the Constitution in order to change it because the Constitution didn't authorize that tax. They wanted to prohibit alcohol. They wanted prohibition. There was nothing in the Constitution that specifically said that you could prohibit alcohol, so they had to amend the Constitution, right? Why didn't they just say, just interpret the Constitution to allow that to happen? Because they had respect for the Constitution back then. They knew that the Constitution meant what it said, and if the Constitution didn't specifically say the government could do something, it couldn't do it. And if they wanted to do it, they had to amend the Constitution, which is what they did. But the best way to understand the simplicity of the Constitution is to read the Constitution itself and to read the words of the people who wrote it, right? So first of all, the father of the Constitution is James Madison. He's considered the father of the Constitution, was a president of the United States, but he is one of the contributors to the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers were a group of papers that were written by the founding fathers to explain the Constitution to people of New York so that they would ratify it, right? Because people didn't really know what the Constitution did or what type of government it created. And so these articles were written in order to basically persuade people in New York that, hey, the Constitution was a good idea. And this is what James Madison wrote about the Constitution. He wrote, "The powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are few and defined." Few and defined. Now, how many people would think about our federal government and say, yeah, the powers are few and defined? I mean, they do almost everything, but they're not supposed to do everything. Their powers are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised primarily on external objects, as war and peace, negotiations, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. So in other words, what James Madison is saying is the federal government has few and defined powers, and mostly having to do with external matters, war and peace and stuff like that. And that's what taxes are going to be for. So to the extent that the federal government is going to tax you, it's going to be to pay for the military. That's basically it. All the normal domestic issues are going to be taken care of by the states. Does that sound like the United States today? No, the federal government does everything, right? Now, if you actually look at the 10th Amendment, too, that helps you understand how the Constitution was written, right? The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. In other words, the federal government can only do what the Constitution specifically says it can do. That's why Madison said the powers are few and defined, because the only powers the federal government has is those few powers that are defined and expressly granted to it in the Constitution. However, the states, they can do anything as long as the power is not denied to them by the states. Now, that doesn't mean the states were all powerful, because every state was limited by its own constitution, right? So the people were protected in the states by the state constitutions, but then the federal constitution said, here are some things that no state can do, regardless of whether or not it's authorized by its own constitution. We're going to ban it at the federal level. But other than that, the state can do whatever it wants, so long as it's not prohibited from doing so in its own constitution. So where are the few and defined federal powers expressed? Well, they're all in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. That's it. So grab yourself a constitution if you don't have one. I mean, they're on the internet. You can just look one up and you can look at it. It's not a big section. There's not a lot of words there. In fact, I'll just read again all of the powers the federal government has. And remember, if I don't read it, if the power is not on this list, it can't do it. That means anything the federal government does that is not enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 is unconstitutional. And see, this is why these hearings are so ridiculous, because Amy Coney Barrett can't admit, right, that almost everything the government is now doing is unconstitutional, right? That's why she doesn't really want to comment on a lot of these cases or a lot of these questions, because I think she's smart enough to know that most of what the government is doing is unconstitutional. But one of the things that she is reassuring everybody is that she will respect precedent, which is unfortunate. What she's saying basically is, look, even if there's a lot of poorly decided cases where things that were clearly unconstitutional were ruled to be constitutional by a court that ignored the Constitution and instead adopted this idea that the Constitution is a living, breathing document, and it doesn't matter what the framers actually intended, what they wrote when they wrote it. We're just going to let Congress do whatever we think is right, and we're just going to change the Constitution from the bench, right? They're going to be judicial activists and rewrite the Constitution to serve the current political agenda of the powers that be, right? What Amy Coney Barrett is saying is, look, even if these bad decisions happened, they're precedent, and I'm just going to respect that precedent, which is unfortunate. I mean, I don't want justices to respect bad precedent, but of course, if she said she wasn't, I mean, they wouldn't confirm her, because she'd have to declare almost everything the federal government is doing unconstitutional, which would be a great thing, because all this unconstitutional stuff is actually really bad, except that government doesn't know that.